The first thing I heard was the water alarm screaming from my basement. By the time I reached the back door, muddy runoff was already tearing across my yard in a fast, brown sheet. It ripped mulch from the flower beds, bent the hydrangeas my late wife had planted, and slammed against the concrete foundation hard enough to make the entire house feel exposed. Beyond my fence, a yellow excavator was still moving.
Look at this mess.
Its bucket swung over a freshly cut drainage trench that pointed straight toward my property.
I told you this would happen if you
didn't
didn't
move. A new culvert had been buried beneath the construction road, and every gallon of stormwater from the townhouse project behind me was being funneled into one concentrated stream. I ran into the rain and started digging a temporary channel away from the basement door. Before I had moved 3 shovelfuls of mud, developer Richard Cole arrived with his site supervisor and Karen Mitchell, the president of our HOA. Richard came across the soaked grass with his face tight and red, pointing at me as though I were the one destroying property. Karen stood under an umbrella with a stack of HOA notices pressed against her chest. Instead of stopping the machinery, they accused me of interfering with an approved construction project. Richard insisted the flooding was caused by an unusual storm. Karen claimed my sandbags and emergency trench violated neighborhood landscaping rules. The site supervisor pulled up the warning stakes I had placed near the broken fence and threw them into the mud. Then Karen handed me a notice stating that I would be fined $250 for every day I refused to fill the trench protecting my own home. I did not threaten them. I did not touch their equipment. I raised my phone and recorded the water, the excavator, the damaged fence, the exposed pipe, and every person standing there pretending this was normal. Richard seemed almost amused. He believed the county permit protected him. He believed the HOA could pressure me into silence. He believed a widower living alone would never risk fighting a multi-million-dollar development. 3 weeks later, that same excavator would be ordered to dig the entire drainage system back out. A red stop work order would be posted across the project entrance. 18 unfinished townhouses would sit abandoned behind locked gates. Richard's company would face more than $500,000 in delays, penalties, engineering costs, and repairs. But that night, none of that had happened yet. I was still standing ankle-deep in filthy water, watching the last garden my wife ever planted disappear beneath runoff that someone had deliberately aimed at my home. And before the rain stopped, I understood something far worse than flooding. My property had not become their drainage system by accident. 8 months before the flood, my life was quiet enough that I measured bad days by ordinary things. A leaking sprinkler head, a loose porch board, a grocery bag splitting in the driveway. I had lived in Cedar Grove for 23 years, long enough to remember when the homes at the end of our street backed up to scrub grass, cedar trees, and a shallow drainage swale that carried rainwater east toward the county storm system. Nothing about the neighborhood was luxurious, but it had always felt settled, predictable, safe. My wife, Emily, and I bought our house when we were both still working full-time and counting every dollar. We replaced the floors ourselves, painted the kitchen twice, and spent years turning the hard clay behind the house into a garden. Emily planted hydrangeas along the rear fence because they reminded her of the flowers outside her grandmother's home in Georgia. After she died, I kept caring for them. That garden was not valuable in the way developers measure value. It did not generate income, increase density, or create another parking space. But every spring, when the first blue and violet blooms opened, the backyard felt like the one place where time had not taken everything from me. I was 52, retired early from municipal water system maintenance, and living alone. I understood pipes, slopes, drainage pressure, and what happened when water was forced into a place it was never meant to go. I was not an engineer, and I never pretended to be one. I was simply a homeowner who paid his mortgage, maintained his property, and wanted to be left alone. For most of those 23 years, I had no serious trouble with the HOA. I paid my dues on time. I kept the grass cut. I repaired my fence before anyone had to complain. When an elderly neighbor had a broken irrigation valve, I usually helped before she needed to call a contractor. Then Richard Cole purchased the vacant land behind our row of houses. His company announced plans for 18 upscale townhouses, 3 stories each, packed onto a parcel that sat several feet higher than my backyard. At the first HOA presentation, Residents were shown polished renderings of stone facades, decorative lighting, and landscaped walking paths. Richard described the project as an investment in the future of Cedar Grove. Karen Mitchell, our HOA president, treated him like a guest of honor. She spoke about rising property values, new landscaping around the clubhouse, and a donation his company planned to make toward improving the neighborhood entrance. Anyone who asked about traffic, construction noise, or drainage was made to sound resistant to progress. I asked one question. I wanted to know where the stormwater would go after the land was cleared, raised, and covered with roofs, pavement, and concrete. Richard said the drainage had been professionally designed and approved by the county. Karen quickly moved the meeting to the next topic. At the time, I accepted the answer. The project began with tree removal, then grading. Trucks arrived before sunrise carrying loads of fill dirt. Week after week, the ground behind my fence rose higher. The natural swale that had carried water east for decades became narrower beneath compacted soil and construction debris. After the first moderate rain, I found standing water near the back fence. It was not enough to frighten me, but it was new. I photographed it and sent a polite email to Richard's office and the HOA. I explained that runoff appeared to be collecting where it had never collected before. Richard's assistant replied that all drainage work complied with the approved plan. Karen told me construction conditions were temporary and warned residents not to interfere with the site. I saved both emails without thinking much about them. That was the kind of person I was then. I believed documentation was simply good housekeeping. I did not yet understand that those routine messages would later prove exactly when they were warned and exactly how casually they ignored it. Over the next several weeks, the puddles became wider. Mud appeared beneath one section of my fence. Fine sediment washed into the flower beds Emily had built by hand. Still, I tried to be reasonable. I told myself large projects were messy. I told myself professionals had reviewed the plans. I told myself the HOA would never knowingly support something that endangered a resident's home. Looking back, that trust was the first thing the project washed away. And if you have ever reported a small property problem only to be told you were overreacting, leave your thoughts in the comments. Sometimes the first photograph, the first email, and the first ignored warning become the most important evidence in the entire case. By the time I realized the drainage behind my house had not merely changed, Richard's crew had already decided where all that water was going to go. The real trouble began when Richard Cole decided the approved drainage system was too expensive. According to the plan presented to the county, his development was supposed to include an underground line running east toward the public storm sewer, along with a retention area large enough to slow the runoff from 18 townhouses, their roofs, driveways, sidewalks, and parking spaces. That system would have taken up valuable land and reduced the number of spaces Richard could advertise to buyers. So his crew started building something else. I noticed the change on a Tuesday morning when the sound of an excavator woke me before 6. By the time I reached the backyard, a section of my rear fence was lying flat in the mud. 2 posts had been pulled from the ground. The edging around Emily's flower bed had been crushed, and the excavator's tracks stopped only a few feet from my patio. A fresh trench had been cut along the construction site. It ran downhill toward the opening in my fence. At the end of that trench sat a large black culvert pipe aimed directly at my yard. Tom Riley, the site supervisor, stood near the machine with a rolled set of plans beneath one arm. He acted as though the damage was ordinary construction work. According to him, the crew needed temporary access for drainage, and the HOA had already approved it. I asked for the easement giving them access to my land. He could not produce one. I asked for the revised drainage plan showing a pipe discharging toward my property. He held up a general construction permit without letting me inspect the pages and insisted that everything on the site had been authorized. Richard arrived less than an hour later in a black SUV. He did not examine the broken fence or the crushed plants. He looked at me with the irritation of a businessman forced to deal with an obstacle. He treated the slope of the land as an excuse. Water moved downhill, he explained, and my yard happened to be lower. In his version of events, the flooding risk was not something his project had created. It was simply nature. But there was nothing natural about that pipe. Natural runoff spread across the ground. This pipe collected water from a large construction site and concentrated it into one narrow outlet. I had spent enough years maintaining municipal water systems to understand the difference. I sent Richard a written notice that afternoon. I included photographs of the displaced fence, the excavator tracks, the damaged landscaping, and the pipe. I demanded that his company stop entering my property and restore everything they had disturbed. Karen Mitchell answered before Richard did. Instead of questioning why a developer had removed part of a resident's fence, she issued an HOA warning against me. The orange stakes I placed around the damaged area were called unauthorized yard decorations. The sandbags I positioned near the flower beds were described as an alteration to the approved landscape. I was ordered to remove them. 2 days later, the first serious rain arrived. Water burst from the pipe with enough force to carve a channel through the grass. Mud covered the lower half of my yard. Mulch, construction gravel, and pieces of plastic sheeting collected against the shed. When the water receded, it left a brown line several inches high across the wooden doors. I photographed everything and sent another email. Richard's office blamed unusually heavy rainfall. Karen repeated that the construction conditions were temporary. Then a second storm hit. This time, the runoff entered the shed. It soaked boxes of tools, destroyed a mower, warped the lower wall panels, and scattered several of Emily's gardening supplies across the floor. One of her old wooden planting boxes floated into the fence and split apart. That loss affected me more than I expected. Richard could replace lumber, tools, and soil with a check. He could not replace the afternoons Emily and I had spent building that box together. To his company, my backyard was simply the lowest point on a grading map. To me, it was the last place in the house that still felt like ours. I called the sheriff's non-emergency line after discovering fresh equipment tracks inside the survey markers near my fence. A deputy came, photographed the area, and created an incident report. He explained that the drainage dispute was primarily a civil and county enforcement matter unless there was clearer evidence of intentional property damage or trespass. Richard treated the absence of an arrest as proof that he had won. His crew returned the next morning. The pipe remained in place. The trench was widened. More soil was packed along the development side, creating a raised berm that prevented runoff from flowing anywhere except toward my property. Then the HOA called an emergency compliance meeting. Karen presented me as the danger to the neighborhood. She claimed my sandbags were obstructing an approved drainage route and could redirect water toward other homes. She never showed the board the approved engineering plan. She never mentioned the broken fence. She never acknowledged that the outlet had been installed only days earlier. By the end of the meeting, the board had approved an initial fine of $1,500. If I refused to remove the sandbags and fill the shallow emergency channel I had dug, additional penalties would be added every day. Richard had flooded my land, damaged my property, and entered my yard without permission. The HOA was punishing me for trying to stop him. As I left the meeting, Richard stood near the clubhouse entrance with Tom. His confidence was no longer subtle. He believed the project's size, the HOA's support, and the cost of hiring an attorney had already defeated me. Later that evening, my neighbor Linda Park came to my door. Her backyard camera faced the corner of the construction site. She had checked the recordings after seeing the damage to my fence. The footage showed Richard's crew arriving before sunrise, removing the fence panels, crossing the property line, and digging the trench while the rest of the street was still dark. It also showed something none of them had mentioned. Richard had been standing beside the excavator when the pipe was aimed at my yard. That was the moment I stopped asking the HOA to protect me. I began preparing to prove that they had helped him do it. The next morning, I stopped trying to convince Richard Cole that he was wrong. I also stopped expecting Karen Mitchell or the HOA board to behave fairly. From that point forward, I treated every email, photograph, repair bill, and minute of camera footage as part of a case that might eventually be read by someone with the authority to act. I created a folder on my laptop and divided it by date. One section held every message I had exchanged with Richard's company. Another held HOA notices, violation letters, and meeting records. I saved the original files instead of relying on screenshots, then copied everything to an external drive and a secure cloud account. I photographed the yard each morning from the same positions: the broken fence, the trench, the culvert outlet, the widening erosion channel, the mud line on the shed, the damaged flower beds, the tracks crossing the place where my property line should have been. I included objects of known size in several photographs, so the depth and width of the damage could not later be minimized. I wrote down the time, rainfall conditions, and water level after every storm. Linda Park gave me the full recording from her backyard camera. The video was clearer than I expected. At 5:47 in the morning, 2 workers removed my fence panels and carried them aside. An excavator then crossed the boundary and began cutting the trench. Richard arrived while the work was underway and stood near the machine as the operator rotated the bucket toward my yard. I copied the recording 3 times and kept the original file untouched. The sheriff's incident report gave me something else I needed: an official date showing when the damage and unauthorized entry had been reported. Richard could still argue about intent, but he could no longer claim that nobody had warned him. My insurance adjuster inspected the shed, tools, landscaping, and erosion near the foundation. He documented the damage but explained that the company needed to determine whether the loss came from natural flooding or the actions of a third party. That distinction mattered. A storm was an event. A pipe deliberately concentrating construction runoff onto private property was a liability. I contacted Maya Grant, an attorney who handled property disputes and construction claims. She did not promise a dramatic courtroom victory. She told me that the strongest case would be the one built before anyone filed a lawsuit. Following her advice, I stopped sending emotional messages. Every communication became brief, factual, and specific. I identified dates, locations, damaged property, and previous warnings. I did not speculate about motives. I asked for documents. Maya sent Richard's company a preservation demand requiring it to retain site logs, internal emails, inspection reports, engineering plans, photographs, equipment records, and all communications involving changes to the drainage system. That letter changed the situation in a way Richard could not see. If records later disappeared, their absence could become evidence of its own. I then hired a licensed surveyor. He located the recorded property corners, reviewed my deed, and marked the boundary with new stakes. His measurements showed that the end of the culvert extended nearly 3 feet into my parcel. The fence section Richard's crew had removed had also stood entirely on my land. There was no shared boundary structure. There was no uncertainty caused by an old fence. There was no legal strip of land the HOA controlled. The pipe was on my property. I requested a signed survey report and photographs of every marker. I also asked the surveyor to record the distance between the pipe, the original fence line, and my foundation. Next, I consulted an independent drainage engineer. He reviewed the storm videos, the slope behind the development, and the concentrated flow leaving the culvert. His preliminary conclusion was straightforward. The water entering my yard was not ordinary sheet runoff. The construction site was collecting water across a much larger surface and forcing it through a single outlet. That increased both the speed and volume of the discharge. The engineer explained that even if water had historically moved downhill, a developer could not necessarily intensify and redirect it without following the approved stormwater design and protecting neighboring properties. The most important records, however, were still at the county office. I visited the permitting department and requested the complete file for Richard's townhouse project. The clerk first provided the general construction permit and several public inspection summaries. Those were the same kinds of pages Tom had waved at me near the excavator. None of them showed the drainage details. I submitted a formal public records request for the approved grading plan, stormwater calculations, erosion control plan, inspection history, engineering revisions, and every document related to discharge along the southern boundary. While I waited, Richard's attorney sent me a letter accusing me of interfering with permitted infrastructure. It demanded that I remove the sandbags and stop approaching the construction boundary. Months earlier, a letter like that might have frightened me into backing down. This time, Maya responded with the survey, photographs of the pipe, Linda's camera footage, and the sheriff's report. She requested the legal easement and the approved revision, authorizing Richard's crew to enter my land. No easement arrived. No revised plan arrived. Richard's crew kept working, but their behavior changed. They avoided my cameras. They stopped crossing the marked survey line during daylight. Fresh soil appeared around the culvert, as if someone had tried to make the outlet look older and more permanent than it was. I photographed that too. 10 days after my records request, the county sent me a digital folder containing hundreds of pages. I spent most of that evening comparing dates, stamps, notes, and engineering symbols. Near midnight, I opened the final approved stormwater plan. The drainage route was marked in blue. It ran east from the townhouse site toward the public storm sewer, more than 200 feet from my backyard. The approved design included a retention area that did not exist on the construction site. There was no trench along my fence. There was no southern culvert. There was no authorized outlet onto my property. Richard had not built the system the county approved. Then I noticed a small note printed near the bottom of the plan. It was easy to miss, but once I read it, I understood why Richard had never wanted me to see the full file. The note did more than prove the pipe was in the wrong place. It showed that directing the water toward my land had been expressly forbidden from the beginning. The note at the bottom of the approved stormwater plan was only one sentence long. No concentrated discharge shall be directed onto adjacent private property. I read it twice, then a third time. The language was not vague. It did not say the developer should try to avoid damage. It did not say runoff could be redirected if the HOA approved. It prohibited exactly what Richard had done. A second note required every material change to the drainage route to be signed by the project engineer and approved by the county before construction. Maya and I searched the entire file again. There was no approved revision. There was no temporary drainage plan. There was no easement across my deed. There was no county authorization allowing Richard's crew to remove my fence, enter my land, or place a culvert inside my property line. The permit Richard had used as a shield did not protect him. It became evidence against him, because it proved the project had been built differently from the design the county had approved. Maya prepared a comparison package. On the left side of each page was the stamped county plan. On the right was a photograph of the actual construction. The approved drawing showed water moving east. The photographs showed the trench running south. The approved plan showed a retention area. The site photographs showed compacted fill and parking preparation where that retention area should have been. The county plan showed no structure near my fence. The survey showed the culvert extending almost 3 feet into my parcel. Then Richard's own records began to surface. Because Maya had sent the preservation demand before filing suit, his company could not quietly discard internal documents without creating an even larger problem. Site logs, field notes, and emails had to be retained. One daily construction report contained a short entry from Tom Riley. The original drainage route conflicted with planned parking, so the crew had rerouted the line south at the owner's direction. Richard Cole was listed as the owner's representative. That entry destroyed the claim that the culvert had been a mistake made by a machine operator. The change had been deliberate. The internal emails were worse. Several weeks before my yard flooded, the project engineer had warned Richard that sending concentrated runoff toward the southern boundary could affect neighboring property. He advised submitting a revised plan and preserving the approved retention area until the county reviewed the change. Richard's response focused on schedule and cost. He did not want to lose parking spaces, delay foundation work, or pay for the original underground connection. He instructed the site team to keep moving. Another email showed that Karen knew I had objected before the serious flooding began. Richard had told her my concerns could slow the project. Karen replied that the HOA would pressure me through compliance notices if necessary. The fines were not an innocent misunderstanding. They were leverage. The sandbags had never been the real problem. The emergency trench had never been the real problem. The HOA had used its enforcement process to force me to accept an unapproved drainage system on my own land. Maya explained why that distinction mattered. The case was no longer limited to water damage from careless construction. The documents supported potential claims involving trespass, private nuisance, property damage, and interference with my use of the land. The survey established the boundary. The camera footage established entry. The approved plan established the required drainage route. The internal records established knowledge and intent. Even the timing worked against Richard. He had been warned before the second storm. He had seen the damage. He had received my written demand. He had allowed the pipe to remain in place and ordered the project forward. That meant each new discharge after the warning was harder to describe as an accident. Maya assembled the evidence into a formal complaint package for the county stormwater division. It included the stamped plan, survey report, date-stamped photographs, storm videos, the sheriff's incident report, damage estimates, HOA notices, and copies of the internal construction records. I also submitted a timeline showing every warning Richard and Karen had received. The first puddling appeared after grading. I reported it. The fence was removed. I reported it. The first flood damaged the yard. I reported it. The second flood entered the shed. I reported it again. By the time the county opened the file, Richard could no longer argue that he had not known. Rebecca Sloan, a county stormwater inspector, called me that afternoon. She asked precise questions about the pipe location, the construction schedule, and whether the site had changed since the photographs were taken. She did not promise to shut anything down. She did not tell me I had won. She asked me not to move the culvert, disturb the trench, or alter the survey markers before her inspection. Maya immediately sent Richard notice that the disputed area had to remain untouched. He ignored it. The next morning, concrete trucks entered the development before sunrise. Richard was trying to complete another set of foundations before the county could inspect the drainage violation. That decision turned a property dispute into an active enforcement case. When Rebecca's county vehicle arrived, Richard walked toward her with the same confidence he had shown in my flooded yard. He carried a copy of the general permit and appeared ready to explain everything away. Rebecca placed the approved stormwater plan across the hood of her vehicle. She compared the eastern drainage route on the drawing with the culvert aimed south toward my house. Then she asked Richard to identify where that southern outlet appeared in the approved records. For the first time since the project began, he had no document to hide behind. Rebecca Sloan did not argue with Richard. She asked for records. Standing beside the county vehicle, she requested the approved drainage plan, the inspection log, the revision history, and the written authorization for the southern culvert. Richard handed her the same general permit he had shown everyone else. It was not enough. A county engineer arrived a few minutes later, followed by a code enforcement officer. They began at the construction entrance and worked their way toward my property. They photographed the grading, measured the slope, checked the erosion barriers, and followed the trench until it reached the opening in my fence. I gave them access to my backyard. The survey stakes were still in place. The culvert outlet extended almost 3 feet beyond the recorded property line. The erosion channel ran from the pipe through the flower beds and toward the foundation. Mud marks on the shed showed how high the water had risen during the second storm. Rebecca compared the GPS position of the outlet with the stamped county plan. The two did not match. The approved system sent runoff east toward the public storm sewer. The actual system sent it south onto my land. The retention area shown in the design had also been replaced by compacted soil intended for parking and future foundations. Richard tried to describe the culvert as temporary construction drainage. Rebecca requested the temporary plan. There was none. He relied on the HOA approval. The code officer made clear that an HOA could not revise a county permit, authorize trespass, or create an easement over a resident's private property. Tom Riley was asked who had ordered the route change. At first, he treated it like a field adjustment made to handle weather conditions. That explanation collapsed when the county engineer referred to the daily site report identifying a southern reroute at the owner's direction. Tom eventually confirmed that Richard wanted to preserve the parking area and avoid delaying the project. The county officers separated the facts from every excuse Richard had used. The rain had been real, but the concentration of runoff was man-made. The project had a permit, but the drainage system had not been built according to it. The HOA had supported the development, but it did not own my yard. The pipe might have been called temporary, but it had remained in place through repeated storms after written warnings and documented damage. Rebecca issued an immediate stop work order. A red notice was posted across the construction entrance. All grading, foundation work, utility installation, and structural activity had to stop until Richard submitted a corrective engineering plan and satisfied the county's stormwater requirements. The silence that followed felt different from every earlier confrontation. For months, Richard had controlled the site through money, schedules, contractors, and confidence. Now every machine behind him was quiet, because a county document had more authority than he did. The corrective order required his company to remove the unauthorized culvert from my parcel, seal the southern discharge, rebuild the drainage system under an approved design, restore erosion controls, and stabilize the disturbed soil. He also had to provide a remediation plan for my property. The county engineer required new calculations accounting for all 18 townhouse roofs, driveways, sidewalks, and parking surfaces. Richard could no longer treat my backyard as the missing retention area. The water had to be managed inside his own development and discharged through the approved public system. A sheriff's deputy returned later that day to supplement the original incident report. The camera footage, survey, and physical position of the pipe gave the unauthorized entry a level of documentation that had not existed during the first visit. Maya sent a formal demand requiring Richard's company to preserve the site, pay for emergency protections, and refrain from entering my property without written permission. She warned that any attempt to remove evidence or restart work could lead to an injunction. The consequences reached the HOA next. At the next public board meeting, residents were shown the approved plan beside photographs of the actual culvert. They saw the emails showing that Karen knew I had objected before the major flooding. They also saw her promise to use compliance notices to pressure me. Karen tried to separate herself from Richard's construction decisions, but the fines carried her name. The treasurer disclosed that Richard's company had offered money for clubhouse landscaping and improvements to the neighborhood entrance. Those discussions had never been clearly presented to residents while Karen was defending the project and punishing me. Board members who had previously trusted her began asking for the enforcement records, emails, and financial disclosures. Richard lost control of the meeting. He blamed the contractor, the weather, the engineer, and finally me. He treated the stop work order as though I had personally issued it. I did not argue back. I placed the stamped drainage plan on the table beside a photograph of muddy water entering my shed. One showed what Richard had been allowed to build. The other showed what he had actually built. By the end of the meeting, nobody needed me to explain the difference. Outside, the townhouse site remained dark and silent. Concrete trucks were canceled. Excavators sat behind locked gates. Subcontractors began sending delay notices, and the project lender requested information about the county violation. The dispute was no longer one homeowner's word against a powerful developer. It was now a documented enforcement case with survey measurements, camera footage, internal emails, inspection findings, and a red order preventing 18 townhouses from moving forward. Richard had believed the county permit would protect him. Instead, it became the document that stopped everything. The stop work order remained in place for 7 weeks. During that time, Richard's company had to hire a new engineering firm, submit a corrected stormwater design, rebuild the missing retention system, and reroute the entire discharge line toward the public storm sewer. 3 partially completed foundations had to be modified because the revised grading plan changed the elevations around them. The financial damage spread quickly. Subcontractors submitted delay claims. Buyers demanded updates. The project lender ordered an independent review. County inspectors placed Richard's future work under increased scrutiny. By the time construction was allowed to resume, his company had absorbed more than $540,000 in penalties, redesign costs, repairs, legal fees, and scheduling losses. My case was resolved through a settlement before it reached trial. Richard's company paid to replace the damaged fence, rebuild the shed, stabilize the eroded soil, and restore the entire section of my backyard affected by the runoff. They covered the insurance deductible, the survey, the drainage engineer, and my attorney's fees. The direct settlement payment was $86,500. More important than the money, the agreement prohibited Richard, his employees, and his contractors from entering my property without written permission. The unauthorized culvert was removed, and permanent boundary markers were installed along the rear property line. The HOA canceled every fine issued against me. At the next election, residents voted Karen Mitchell out as board president. The new board adopted stricter disclosure rules for developer donations and required legal review before the HOA could use violation notices in disputes involving private property rights. Karen had once believed her position allowed her to decide whose complaints mattered. In the end, the emails bearing her name became the reason residents stopped trusting her. Tom Riley cooperated with the county investigation and left Richard's company several months later. The primary contractor was placed on probation for future county projects and required to submit additional inspection documentation. The townhouse development was eventually completed, but it no longer looked like Richard's original plan. Several parking spaces disappeared to make room for the retention basin he had tried to avoid building. The finished project carried the cost of every shortcut he thought nobody would question. My backyard recovered more slowly. Some of Emily's hydrangeas could not be saved. One damaged plant, however, still had a living branch beneath the mud. I cut it back, replanted it near the porch, and watched new leaves appear the following spring. The first heavy rain after the new drainage system was completed came late one afternoon. I stood beneath the covered patio and watched water move through the development's retention area, into the approved line, and away toward the county storm sewer. Not one stream crossed my fence. My shed remained dry. The soil stayed in place. The small hydrangea near the porch bent under the rain, but it did not break. I had spent months being told that I was difficult, unreasonable, and powerless. I had been fined for protecting my home and blamed for damage another person knowingly caused. I did not win because I had more money than Richard. I did not win because I shouted louder than Karen. I won because I saved the first email, photographed the first puddle, protected the camera footage, ordered the survey, and found the county plan they hoped I would never read. If this story reminded you of someone being ignored by an HOA, developer, or contractor, share it with them. Leave a comment about how you would have handled the situation, save the video in case you ever need the reminder, and subscribe for more stories about property rights, evidence, and quiet legal justice. Because sometimes the strongest boundary around your home is not a fence, it is a complete record of the truth.